Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Timpley from the International Food Safety and Quality Network, and we're here today for edition 31 of the Food Safety Fridays webinar program. Well, HACCP, HACCP, CCP, PRP, GMP, OPRP, PRP, OMG. How many acronyms do the food safety industry want? Well, I've got some good news and bad news today. I'll start with the bad news. We've got another acronym, TACCP, TACCP, Threat Analysis Critical Control Point. That's the bad news. We've got another acronym to remember. The good news is we've got Ruth Bell here, who's going to tell us all about TACCP. So we don't need to fear it. We don't need to fear this new term. Okay. Ruth's going to be with us shortly. I'd just like to thank the sponsors of Food Safety Fridays, Trace Analytics, IFS, FSSC and Safe Food 360. These kind organisations have been sponsoring Food Safety Fridays for the whole of 2015 and bringing you these 31 webinars so far free of charge with a free certificate. So you can't say fairer than that. Okay. We've got Ruth today, Ruth Bell from AF Associates in the UK. Hello, Ruth. Welcome back.
Hello, Simon. Thank you. Thank you.
It's nice to have you back again today.
Thank you.
And the sun's shining there in, where is it, Ruth? Tell the audience.
Yorkshire Dales, Wensleydale in the Yorkshire Dales, and it's a beautiful day. You wouldn't think it was October.
I know, it's fantastic, isn't it? Well, it's good to have you bringing some sunshine with us today. I'll be back with you shortly, Ruth. I'm just going to talk about next week's webinar. Okay. Next week, ladies and gentlemen, we have food labelling regulations, and we've got Dr. Yasser Mustafa Mohammed. Yasser's been with us a couple of times this year, and he's done a couple of good presentations. Next week, it's all about food labelling. What do they mean? Stakeholders, general food labelling requirements, international standards, the main risks in food labelling, control measures, role of concerned parties, and references. So that will be worthwhile, especially with things like allergens and labelling, these increasing demands and risks there. Okay, just to say, today's webinar is being recorded. It does say that at the top. It's recorded every week, and we distribute the recording and the slides within 24 hours of this finishing. So don't be concerned if you miss a little bit or you can't quite see the slides or anything like that. It's all recorded and you will get to see it. If you have a question or a comment, just type it in the sidebar. We'll be having a couple of polls during this webinar, so we'll be hoping that you join in with that. So hello and welcome. It's nice to have you all along again. If you could get your PowerPoint up, Ruth, and then we'll come over to you. I shall just share actually next week's webinar, and if you can actually just click on that sign me up button and register right here and now, and it will open in a new window so it won't disturb this webinar. So I'll leave that up for a few minutes so that you can do that. I'll be back for the Q&A and the polls shortly, and over to Ruth for now.
Great, thank you.
Ruth, it's all yours.
Great, okay. Has that come up?
Yes, we can see that, Ruth.
Excellent, excellent. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome along to TACCP for Food Defence. I hope you're going to find this interesting. It's quite a new acronym for some of us. HACCP's been around for quite a long time, but now we've got another tongue twister here. Okay, so just a little bit about me. As Simon said, I'm based in the UK, and I work as a consultant in the industry. My particular specialisms are around implementing quality and food safety management systems. I do a lot of technical support, and I also audit third-party standards such as ISO and BRC. I'm representing AF Associates, and we are international food safety and quality management specialists. Do travel around the globe, implementing systems for both food and feed manufacturers. and a variety of different bits of advice, technical support, training, and we also offer e-learning in some of the subjects that we present. So anyway, that's enough about us, and on to today's webinar. We haven't got long today, so it's very much an overview, and thinking first of all about defence of a food system and what is it and why we're doing it. Understanding the attacker, who's going to actually attack us, who are we having to defend ourselves against, the types of threats that could be posed by our attackers, and then a very brief overview of the TACCP process and how we would put a system in place to defend ourselves. Okay, so if we move on and thinking about how we defend our food system, it's really a logical and systematic evaluation in a similar way to a HACCP system, but we're looking at where we're vulnerable to threats in the supply chain. So where have you got weaknesses, where there is a potential for an attacker to cause some sort of harm to your foods? And this is your threat assessment critical control point, or TACCP. But we would look for threats, we assess vulnerabilities, and then we put protection measures or mitigation strategies in place. And generally, this then is incorporated into our crisis management or business continuity management, which we're all probably very familiar with from other aspects of systems. The first thing probably to say is that there can be differences between whether you're looking to defend your food system just on your site, or whether you're looking further down the supply chain and you're looking to conduct a raw material vulnerability assessment. So these are things that we'll talk about and discuss as we go through the webinar. But to defend our food system, the aim really is to protect your food business from all forms of malicious attack or from intentional contamination. And we can't always completely protect from malicious attack, but what we can do is risk assess, and then we can put procedures in place to minimise the impact of a malicious attack actually happening. And we judge impact by how it would affect the business, how it would affect the consumer. And I'll come on and expand about those a little bit later on in the webinar. But as I say, the threat assessment critical control point system, it builds on an effective HACCP system, and I'm going to explain about that in a couple of minutes. But before we do, we have a poll, and I think it would be very interesting for us to find out what is it that's driving your business to implement TACCP. So is it a customer requirement? Is it a requirement in a standard such as BRC, IFS? Is it a legal requirement for you, for instance, Food Safety Modernisation Act? Or is there another reason that you're doing it? So just for your own peace of mind or for your business continuity. So shall I leave Simon to deal with the poll?
Yeah, I've already loaded the poll. I'm quite efficient. I've put the poll in the sidebar. What is driving your business to implement TACCP? Customer requirement, a requirement of a standard. If so, which? Please type in the chat if it's a particular standard. A legal requirement on the final one is other reason. If so, what? I mean, we perhaps should have put another one on there that said we're not being driven to implement it. But the poll at the moment, we've got 40-something% saying it's a requirement of a standard.
Yeah.
And then roughly equal a customer requirement and other reason, if so, what? And 16 illegal requirement. I'd be interested to know as well what those other reasons are. So again, type in the chat. So we're getting a lot of BRC issue 7.
Yeah, what a surprise! 5.4.
Shona, you deserve an award there. I'm trying to be proactive, so that's great, Shona.
Great.
Self-motivated. FSMA, BRC. Quincy is not needed, but just wants the knowledge of it. That's fine. Yeah, BRC, FSSC, customer requirements. Yeah. So various. Going back to the poll, yeah, it ended up that standard was the major one, but then customer requirement, other reasons, and legal requirement were all 20s and 14s. So we'll end that poll there.
Right.
Is that what you expected to see?
I think it probably is, yes, that it's going to be a requirement of the standard, and I was interested to see how many people were asking or saying it's a requirement of the BRC version 7, the global food standard, because within BRC version 7 at the moment they're just asking for a raw material vulnerability assessment for food fraud. So it's very much looking at the front end of the food chain, as opposed to TACCP, which looks right the way through the food chain and through your own process and your own operation. So there's a few subtle differences, but I'm going to come on and try and explain a little bit about the difference just now. As we said before, we're all very familiar with TACCP. And TACCP is there to protect your product for food safety, but from unintentional or accidental adulteration. With the TACCP system, we're not intending to put agents into our products. It's all unintentional, so it's physical objects dropping into or cross-contamination of microorganisms. So on the TACCP side, we've got food safety, and then we've also got food quality. Again, quality issues traditionally, it's happened because of unintentional issues. Whereas if we move over onto the other side of the line, this is where we begin to get into the intentional adulteration, or what's known as malicious attack. And we probably haven't really been thinking as much about these areas. So we then split down and we talk about food defence, and that's where we're putting measures in place to defend against ideologically driven issues. And the motivation when it's ideologically driven is harm, and we tend to use a TACCP system to control that type of issue. And then at the bottom of the slide towards the right, you'll see we've got the economically driven, which is your food fraud, and there the motivation is gain. But for both food defence and food fraud, this is where somebody's intentionally either putting something into the product that will cause harm or to cause financial gain. If you notice again down at the bottom right, the food fraud, that's really where we're focusing at the moment for BRC version 7, 5.4, whereas TACCP tends to look a little bit more at the how to control against the ideologically driven, the harm, as well as some of the economically driven. So this is how the GFSI have begun to define how we control food safety from both unintentional and intentional adulteration. I'll just say at this point, it does depend perhaps where you are in the world and which texts you're reading. You can find various different definitions. Some people will find a definition of food defence, meaning it's procedures to assure you security of your food and drink from both the ideological and economic, whereas other people will find definitions of food defence just for the ideologically driven, the harm. Personally, I wouldn't get too tied up. The important thing is that you're putting a system in place and you are preventing both harm and fraud. Just a word then, a few terms that we start to use, and it's really starting to understand these so that we can begin to put our systems in place. So we talk about an asset, and an asset's what you're trying to protect. So for us in the food industry, generally the asset is the product, or it's the raw material that's going into the product. But you could be also trying to protect your business property, information. For instance, it might be a secret recipe you don't want somebody to get hold of. So we're always trying to protect our asset, and then the threat is what you're actually trying to protect against. And the threat is anything that can exploit a vulnerability. Basically, a threat can be seen as a deliberate act by an individual or a group to cause harm to the consumer or loss to the business. And somebody said to me one day, which I quite like, when you start to look at this side, the malicious contamination, you've got to take your technical hat off for a minute, and you've got to start to think like a criminal. As if you wanted to attack a business, how would you do it? How would you? What would you use, and how would you do it? So, coming on, a vulnerability, that's the weakness or the gap in your protection measures, your control measures. And so, if you were somebody wanting to attack a business, you would look where that business was weak and where you would have a good possibility of an attack being successful. And then the risk, well, that's the risk assessment. That's what is the likelihood of that threat actually being successful and causing harm. So we're saying that threats are people motivated, and for malicious contamination, people they do need some sort of motivation. And a successful attack depends on several things, and these will also dictate the size of the threat. So first of all, we've got the motivation to overcome obstacles. So if it's difficult, people won't do it. If you wanted to get into a business and it was secure and it was locked and there was CCTV, you maybe won't do it. Whereas if it's easy to walk in, it's a lot easier. As an attacker, though, you also have to have the capability or the agent to carry out the attack. So you have to have, if you're going to maliciously contaminate with glass, you have to have a source of glass that you can use. If you want to use pathogens, you've got to have a source of pathogens that you can use. You've got to have the opportunity to carry out the attack. Are you able to actually get in and get to the point that you want to in a process to cause malicious contamination? And how would you be deterred by the chance of detection or fines, prosecutions, jail? So we have to begin to think about all of these factors. But when we think about the attacker, there are four main types. There are insiders. These are people who work within a corporation, and these are probably the most likely to actually be able to attack because they are already working within the organisation. They'll have access to processes and to products. Whereas when you start to look at the other suppliers and contractors, particularly contractors, if they're allowed to come into factory environments and walk quite freely around, they do have a good chance of attack. Supply chain personnel, possibly people delivering product, and then the outsiders. These are people who have no actual direct contact with the business, but may see you as a good target. So we have to think of who the attacker might be, and then what is their motivation. So it could be a local grievance, for instance, with the company. Maybe we've had a disciplinary, some sort of issue within the company. It could be for economic advantage, and this is probably where we start to see a lot of different fraudulent activities going on. It may be for political disruption or mass casualties. This tends to be the ideologically motivated stuff, maybe where somebody's trying to raise a point about a cause. The other thing to say, of course, though, is that intentional contamination, it may be an individual doing this, or it could be a group. generally, the larger the organisation, the more professional the output. So we have different types of attacker. Your extortionist, their aim is financial, and they probably target high-profile businesses, and the idea is that they're wanting to extort money from the business. They wouldn't want to be detected, and a good deterrent for them is actually the chance that they would be caught carrying out this extortion. Your opportunist, they generally, it could be somebody who's in an influential position actually within the company, got access to product, access to process. Again, they don't want to be detected. An opportunist, probably it could be financial gain, maybe some fraudulent activity within the food chain. The extremists, their aim is very definitely harm, and they will also want publicity. They will want detection, but after the event, they will be deterred if it's likely that the attack is going to have failure before the event's actually happened. The irrational individual, well, they're the difficult ones because they tend not to have any motive at all and act completely irrationally. They're probably not bothered whether they are or aren't detected. But generally, if you make detection easy, then they're more likely to be deterred. The disgruntled individual, that's somebody who possibly is an insider, works within an organisation, and generally their aim is revenge, possible embarrassment, financial loss for the company. Generally, they don't intend any harm, but they do want to be detected to cause that embarrassment. But again, sort of after the event. Your hacktivists, which I think is a wonderful word, and the cyber criminals, their aim is to steal or to corrupt data, stop computer systems from working, and generally it's criminal motivation for them. But they won't want detection, and a good deterrent is them actually not being able to get in, so there's firewalls and so on. And then the professional criminals, very much their aim is financial, so it's fraudulent, and again they're probably not wanting to be detected. So we've got the motivation of the attacker. Generally, it's thought probably the extremists will be the most highly motivated, down to perhaps the disgruntled individuals, the irrational individuals, likely to be the least motivated. But remember, it does take into account all the other factors as well. So how much access have they got, and the likelihood of detection, and the agent that they might use to cause the malicious attack. So very similar to TACCP, we talk about the chemical, the biological, the physical agents. We also have radiological agents. So chemicals that we could cause malicious contamination with, it might be things like industrial chemicals, veterinary residues. We're all probably fairly familiar with the Sudan 1 dye, things like counterfeited alcohol, methanol instead of ethanol. Biological, there's a whole range of different biological agents, but harmful pathogens could be used. Physical, I suppose it's the similar ones that we would find within a HACCP system, things like needles, glass, metal, but that they've been intentionally added for harm. The radiological, these are things like cesium, isotopes of iodine, various different radiological properties that could be added. Of course, though, whoever the attacker is, they've got to have access to an agent and be able to use it undetected. So these are things that your attacker would be thinking about. They would also be thinking about an agent that would be difficult to actually detect when it was in the food whilst they were carrying out their attack. So the different types of threat that we've got, The two in red are the two most common ones. So that's the malicious contamination, whether it is with something chemical, something radiological, or the what we term economically motivated adulteration, which is the food fraud. So things like counterfeiting, dilution, mislabeling, substitution. And then we get into some of the less likely, but extortion for money, espionage, trying to get commercial advantage from competitors, maybe by pinching recipes and specifications. Counterfeiting, again, fraudulently based. Counterfeited alcohol probably is a very common one. And then the cybercrime, really to financial and to defraud the business. So when we think about the attacker, we have to start to think about, well, what are our threats? Where are we weak or where are we vulnerable? And then begin to put necessary controls in place to reduce the risk, to mitigate the risk down, in a very similar way to conducting a HACCP system. So the process, basically, we're looking at what our threats are. We're looking at the likelihood of an attack. We're thinking about the potential impact of a successful attack. So are we looking at business closure, or are we looking at customer complaint, or are we looking at no real impact? And we have to think about then the priority that we're going to give to different threats and put appropriate controls in place. Part of the assessment process within a TACCP system, though, is to keep the system live, as we're familiar with HACCP, but it's all about intelligence and horizon scanning, because new threats can appear, and we, as a business, we have to be aware of those. And it may be that we have to risk assess certain areas as a result of information and intelligence. So the four key questions that we're really wanting to ask and really looking at: who might want to attack us? How might they do it? Why and where are we vulnerable? And how can we stop them? So this is what we're thinking about. So the actual TACCP process, those of you that are familiar with HACCP, you'll see it's very, very similar. We need a team. We need a multidisciplinary team. In this instance, probably people from security, because they know sort of about the security of the premises. Somebody from HR, because we're talking about threats being people motivated, so understanding the staff on site. Production, the raw material supply, so knowledge of the production process, perhaps areas in production where we've got vulnerable areas. Distribution, the logistics and the distribution, and the technical. So we need a mix of people on a team, and then the team would go on to determine the scope of the study. So this is where perhaps at the moment, if we were looking to satisfy the requirements of BRC version 7 5.4, we'd be just looking at a vulnerability assessment on the raw material supply chain. Whereas if we're looking at requirements of other standards, perhaps IFS standard, FSSC, then we might be looking at the site as well. So the scope of the study, it tells us where we're starting, where we're finishing, and we would then draw a process flow diagram out of the process that we're going to look at within the scope of the study. We would then go on to establish and define the threats at each step in the process, look for where we're vulnerable, conduct a risk assessment, identify our protection measures, mitigation measures, implement, audit the system, review the system, and keep it live by also horizon scanning. So very much a plan, do, check, act approach. Okay, so going on to think about the threats, as I say, instead of identifying hazards as you would do in HACCP, we're starting to identify threats And remember, we said this, it could be a group or it could be an individual, but it's the threat of the harm from the malicious intent. And just remember again, as a bit of a recap, the size of the threat is dependent on the attacker's motivation, their capability, their agent, how vulnerable you are, and the prospect of the attack actually being successful. So we do have a few assumptions that we have to make, because malicious intent, it's people based. We need a person, or we need a team, and generally the attacker will want to see a fairly immediate impact. So they're not going to attack and want to wait for 6 months. It's something that they want to see happen straight away. Just something to always be aware of, though. You can deter attacks, but you maybe won't always prevent them. Somebody who is very, very, very highly motivated, it could be very difficult to deter them. But it's having the measures in place, not only to be protective, but to be reactive if necessary. Somebody who's going to attack will need to have knowledge of your product, of your process, how they're going to get into the operation, to be able to conduct an attack. And the different mitigation measures that we've got in place, some of it's physical, so it's security, it's barriers, some of it's through the software, the electronic systems, and some of it's through ensuring personnel security. But with a TACCP system, really, it's the food manufacturing, it's the product assembly that's the focus of the attention. You've maybe heard people also talking about VASP, and that's where the attention probably lies on the raw material supply chain. But to be honest, the process and what you do is very, very similar. So in terms of assessing threats within our operation, we would start to look at threats to the product, to the premises, and to the organisation. So, for instance, in terms of the product, you might be thinking, have there been any significant cost increases affecting the product's raw materials over the last few months? Because this is where we could possibly see the potential for fraud coming in, with somebody substituting a cheaper ingredient. Around the premises, you might be looking at is the premises situated in a sensitive area, so politically, or do you have issues going on within your organisation, so you have disgruntled staff perhaps? How easy is access? Do you have access for staff who no longer work at the site? And then around the organisation, it's how high is the profile of an organisation that has a very high profile, or maybe a high profile chief executive, more likely to attract some form of attack. So we begin to look at these. And what I'm saying is, if you do have a short supply chain with less people involved, there is likely to be less risk than a much longer supply chain and an awful lot of people. Okay, so we've got another poll just now. What do you think your biggest threat would be? Do you think it would be something to your product, or do you think it would be around your premises, or do you think it would be your organisation? Okay,
I've loaded that in the sidebar.
Great.
If you vote on that. Do you think your biggest threat would be to your product, premises, or organisation? And products, the winner by far, with 2/3 of votes saying product. In fact, yeah, 2/3 product, and then 20% premises, and then closely followed by organisation. But product, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me too much. I wasn't expecting the organisation to come very, very high, but I thought between product and premises it might be quite close. But, obviously, it's product that people are concerned about.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll move on. So we begin to think about threats, and at each stage in your process, you would begin to look at what potential threats that you could get, and then we have to think about where are the vulnerabilities, or where are the weaknesses in the process. So, for instance, if we were looking at a process, an open mixing vessel in a quiet production area, perhaps where there are lone workers, there's no CCTV, you're much more vulnerable to attack. It could possibly be from a disgruntled insider than if you had a closed mixing vessel and it was in the central production area, you had CCTV, and there were a lot of staff in that particular area. So it's beginning to look at all the different issues that you've got at the different points in your process, to determine where you may be weak. And you have to be, as a TACCP team, confident that your food processing operation is being produced, I said they're in trustworthy hands, but you are confident that your staff aren't going to be causing you any risk in terms of malicious contamination. So we would identify our threats, we would look for where we have vulnerabilities or weaknesses, and we would then begin to risk assess. And in any form of risk assessment, it's understanding your threats, and then really focusing on the ones that we consider to be high risk, the priority ones. And in this system, whereas within a HACCP system, we very definitely would identify CCP, critical control point, and go through a decision-making process to determine critical control points. This assessment of risk, basically, we would start to categorize high, medium, low risk, and then really your critical control point are the ones that you decide are your priority ones, although there isn't really a formal way of determining your CCP as there is in HACCP. But what we're really looking at is the impact of loss. So this is the impact to the business and or the consumer of a successful attack. And then in terms of vulnerability, we're looking at the basically how likely is somebody to effectively attack. And where are your weaknesses? So what we would do in terms of impact, we would begin to categorize. We've got a 5 being catastrophic, 4 major, down to 1 being a minor. So perhaps 5, a HACCP team would deem that to be the business. We'd have business closure. Maybe a 1, a minor, there would be little effect. Perhaps if you were talking about major, you would have some serious financial loss. If we look at the likelihood of the threat happening, the vulnerability, which is how motivated the attacker is and their opportunity, a 5, very high chance of causing a problem, down to 1, unlikely to happen. So as I say, probably somebody like an extremist would score a 5, whereas the disgruntled individual maybe a 2 or maybe a 3, depending on the scenario. So what would happen? You would determine a number for your impact. You would determine a number for your likelihood. So let's say, for example, for impact, we've gone for a 3. And for likelihood, we've gone for a 3. This would take us across and up. We come into orange, and we've got a threat level C here, which is moderate risk. Alternatively, if you decided that your impact was 5 and your likelihood of the attack was also a 5, you're into red, your threat A. And all we're really doing is beginning to assess based on risk, and then we'll put appropriate protection measures, mitigation strategies in place. So if you like, the threat A or the CCP moving down to possibly threat E, very, very unlikely that it's going to cause you problems. So we need to start to think about what our preventative measures are to stop the ideologically motivated attack. Remember, ideally, if you can deter people from causing you an attack, you're less likely to suffer an attack. So a lot of these preventative measures, they're the things that we would have in place. If you did define that you had a high risk, well, then you need to be putting more measures in place and then monitoring them and carrying out corrective actions as necessary. So around personnel, you're looking at things like personnel security. How do you know who you've got on your site? How do you know how many people that you've got on your site? Do you know the background of your personnel? Around the premises, that's really the security. So how secure is your premises? Access to different parts of the production. How do people access? Is it swipe card? Is it key card, fingerprint, or is it open access? Not just for staff, but also for contractors, visitors. Within your process, it's looking at how much access is there to machinery. So I gave the example before of open vats and open vessels. Are things locked down? Are they inaccessible? Do you have tamper evidence seals? Do you have tamper evidence on maybe where we're taking in deliveries? We've got various different mechanisms that we can use. Around the services, it's things like the security of your utilities, particularly if you've got shared utilities. Are they locked down before the utilities come onto your site? Again, possibly if you've got controversial neighbours, that sharing utilities is or can be an issue. And around your logistics, particularly once your product's out and being delivered, there's a good potential for vulnerability depending on where wagons and trucks and boats and planes are, and the sort of various different access points to product. So for instance, trucks, where are they stopping for brakes, and do people have the potential to get in and cause contamination to the product at that point? So the preventative measures, it's all about thinking, what do we need to have in place to secure all of these, to secure the personnel, the premises, the process, the services, and the logistics. So what you would need to do is to put your preventative measures in place for those hazards that you perhaps deemed as being very high risk. It may be that you then re-risk assess, and you've perhaps managed to mitigate a little bit and bring the risk down. If it's not possible to bring the risk down, then you just need to make sure that you're monitoring those preventative measures very frequently to assure yourself that you aren't going to be a victim to attack. If we are attacked, then obviously you have to get into your crisis management and business continuity, and it's all beginning to look at, well, where finding out about the attack, when did it happen, how did it happen, and then going from there. So we need to make sure that our emergency and crisis management procedures are in place, they are developed, and they are trialled. But this is an area where we will already have this type of system in place for the unintentional contamination within the TACCP system. So fairly familiar area for most of us. Of course, the TACCP system, it's plan, do, check, act. So we make sure our preventative measures are in place, they're implemented, they're working. If we do have an attack, we obviously have to initiate our crisis management, but we have to keep the system live. So we do need to review our protection arrangements. You definitely, as a HACCP team, need to be very, very aware of any changes that could affect your assessment and go back and reassess. we have to continually horizon scan for new hazards, new issues coming up that could affect your system. It's very much reviewing what's going on around you, and looking is the potential for weaknesses within your systems. And goes without saying really, but any reviews you do need limited circulation, because you might just be giving your attacker all the information that they need. But certainly it's keeping abreast of what's going on out there, horizon scanning. It may be that one of your raw materials, you find out there's been a crop failure, which could increase the cost of raw material. That then increases the potential for fraud. You become more vulnerable. So you may have to put some extra monitoring measures in place. Okay, so one final poll there. Just to really find out, are you going to conduct TACCP on your own site, or are you going to conduct a raw material vulnerability assessment on your supply chain? Maybe both. Maybe we should have had another one of both.
Yeah, well, I've made the poll say, do you need to conduct TACCP and/or vulnerability assessment? So most people are saying yes, they do need to do one or the other or both.
Okay. Okay.
So 90% yes.
Great. Okay.
So another job to do.
Yes. Okay, so just to summarise, we do need to protect our business from malicious attack, whether it's unintentional in the form of harm, or whether it's a fraudulent attack. Generally, those who are attacking you fraudulently don't intend to cause harm. However, depending on what the agent is that's being used for the fraudulent attack, then it can be harmful. But if we have systems in place, then we should be able to maintain our brand reputation and business continuity. If we haven't, we've potentially got some areas where you could be subject to an attack. But initially, it's deciding, do I need to look at my own process, my own operation? Do I need to look at my raw material supply chain, or am I going to look at the whole of the supply chain and my own process? But it's all about preventing malicious attack. Okay, and I'm just looking at the clock, and I think we've probably got enough time for a few questions before it's 4 o'clock and we're over and out.
Right, thanks very much for that, Ruth. That was fantastic. Obviously, in such a short time, it's not possible to go into great detail. All that's possible is an overview. But yes, we have got time for some questions. If you can stop sharing your screen now, Ruth.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, is it right to say, Ruth, that there's always been, for quite a while, a requirement for food defence and security systems within food businesses? But what we're saying now is TACCP is a methodology for looking at that and assessing it in almost exactly the same way as you do with HACCP. That you start with your team, and you understand what the risks are. You do your flow chart, and then you do your hazard analysis, etc., and then you put your control measures in, etc. So it's nothing new, food defence and security, is it? But is it that just TACCP is new?
I think even TACCP's been around a while, but I think we're now beginning to sort of link up a TACCP system with food defence, and I think it's they're things that have been there, but we haven't necessarily tied it all together. Yes, now we're starting to look at tools and systems to protect against food defence and malicious contamination. I mean, there are other systems. There's a carver and shock system, or there's the Food and Drink Federation have a 5-question system for protecting against food defence. So there are other tools out there. So I suppose TACCP is one tool that you can use to protect your business from malicious attack.
And if you chose, just speaking from an auditor point of view, if you chose to use, let's say, Carver as your model for assessing threats, would that be sufficient for someone like BRC version 7, or is that not enough?
No, you just have to show that you have logically assessed your process. So you could use any tool that you wanted to do it. I think where we're at the moment, we're probably where HACCP was 25 years ago, where there were various different tools that people used. And then, of course, along came Codex, and we now tend to all use the same methodology. And I think at the moment we've got a variety of different tools, a variety of different methodologies, and it that can sometimes be a little bit negative because it can cause confusion and it can cause a few issues. But from an audit perspective, it's the fact that you've assessed, and it doesn't really matter which tool you're using.
But it does make sense to me that going through it takes you through a logical step-by-step approach. And you are looking at and risk assessing to see which is likelihood and severity, to find out which and then you're almost putting your prerequisite procedures in place, which is your site security and your employee and visitor controls and all that, and then you get down to the nitty gritty. Is there anything specific, a critical? But like you said, there's probably not any critical control points as such in most businesses. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably, I think it's been called TACCP because it rhymes nicely with HACCP and everything else.
Well,
but
that's it, yeah.
It's all just based on risk. And if you find you've got some areas that are very high risk, if you can, you try to reduce the risk down a little bit. But if not, you're just saying it's high risk, which sort of equates to, it's the critical control point, which is telling you that you need to put a little bit more emphasis on monitoring at those points in your process. But no, it's not as formalized as determining CCPs as you would do in a HACCP system.
No.
I think that I was just going to say the key thing is it's very much you've got to keep it live, because threats are changing continually, and that's why it's so important that somebody's out there and sort of horizon scanning and just seeing what's going on, because you could be victim to a malicious attack from something that you sort of had missed or haven't thought about.
Yeah, sure. And like you say, just as your HACCP team review changes to legislation or regulations to do with food safety or whatever, that's an input. Again, you have a TACCP team meeting regularly to look at the horizons and make plans, etc. Kirsten's asked a good question, because it's a question on my lips as well, is how common, and you might not know, Ruth, how common are intentional contamination events? I mean, I personally would expect the food industry is worldwide. It's huge. It's farm to fork. It is very exposed, and I would have thought we'd have been hearing about. I don't want to give anybody any ideas, but I would have thought we'd been hearing about things on a daily basis, really.
I think probably there's more fraud in the food chain than there perhaps is malicious contamination for harm. And because the fraudulent activities, particularly the big groups, the professional criminals, they're very good at going undetected for quite a long time, which is why we're probably not as aware of how much is or has happened, because it hasn't been detected. But Malicious contamination, I couldn't tell you just exactly how much it has happened, but I mean, it has, and it does, and it will continue to.
Yeah. And okay. Ashley has said, should TACCP be used independently or as another consideration within HACCP? Should it be kept separate from HACCP?
I would personally keep it separate. I mean, I certainly think as you were developing the system, you would keep it separate. I mean, it may be that you want to combine it when you're at implementation stage, but I think it's what works for you and your business. But I personally would keep them separate.
Yeah, documentation wise, I'd probably keep it separate. But what about the team itself? I mean, would you have the same? Your HACCP team would also be your TACCP team, or is there different members that possibly on a TACCP team?
I think you've got some different members, because I think you've got to think this is an awful lot about people and personnel. So I think you definitely need your HR input onto TACCP, where you may not see that in HACCP, and the same sort of from the security, the site security, and maybe logistics, which are the three that probably would stick out as not perhaps sitting on a HACCP team, but certainly production, technical, raw materials. You would see those. Engineers you would see on both probably as well, but
yeah, so similar, but maybe with a couple of extra members. Theophilus has made a good point that it's on the head. I think TACCP is a systematic approach of putting in place a food defence programme, and that sums it up really, doesn't it? It's a systematic approach, step by step, that leads you through it. And I can see that. I can see that being useful. Yeah. Okay. My word, there's so many comments. It's quite difficult to keep up with. What does this T stand for? I mean, even I can answer that. The T stands for threat. Threats.
Yes. Threat analysis. Yeah. I think the confusion comes because TACCP threat analysis, critical control point, you're looking for threats, and then the analysis is looking where you're weak or your vulnerability. And then you hear about VASP, which is vulnerability assessment critical control point, which is asking where I'm vulnerable. But to be perfectly honest, in a vulnerability, you've still got a threat, because you still have to be weak. Oh, excuse me, weak to that threat.
Okay, that's no problem. Lots of questions. Will the size of the organisation not determine the level and extent of TACCP? Well, it would do, wouldn't it, Ruth? Depending on the size and complexity of your organisation, would depend on probably the size and complexity of if you're buying lots of materials and you've got lots of product lines and you've got a big site and lots of employees and maybe lots of temporary employees. All of this complicates things. If you've got half a dozen people in a one simple unit making one product, it becomes much simpler.
It does. Although I mean, you could end up with a very big operation, a very complex operation, a very people-dense operation, but actually find that you've got an awful lot of protection measures in place. So your vulnerability is quite low, but it's the fact you have to go through the process of working through the information to determine that. Yeah.
Somebody said, and I wager that it's my friend Javier, he said, there is HACCP, VASP and TACCP. Will there also be SAP? I don't know what he's trying to say, but please explain what SAPPC means, Javier. It's definitely you. Okay. There's probably more questions amongst that, but we're up to the hour mark. We can't really take any more time from people. They've got other commitments. So what we will do is we'll capture all them like we do. And if there's anything, hopefully you'll, in the email we send round or on the forum, pick up on that, Ruth. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yep. I think somebody also said, you know, do you have to have training? Should you have TACCP training? Somebody mentioned, and somebody mentioned, can we have the Excel sheet and things? But there are plans, are there, to do a longer course, you know, like a 4-hour course on this, because
Yes.
it was really just the headlines of a TACCP study, this really, wasn't it?
Yes. Oh, yes. Everything that we've talked about, you then have to get into the detail of it, which in an hour you just can't do. So it was very much an overview of just this is the TACCP process, but certainly training is the TACCP team needs to be trained. Yeah,
and they need to be able to work through this methodology with some examples. And
yes,
so they. Well, watch this space, basically, ladies and gentlemen, for a course coming through in the near future on that. Okay, I think we're going to leave it there, Ruth. I don't know if your dog's barking, your phone's going, I think that might be my doorbell. I don't know if it was yours or mine. You're obviously in demand somewhere. So thanks very much for your time today on behalf of the IFS. On behalf of myself and all the attendees today on Food Safety Fridays. So thanks, Ruth.
Pleasure, yes, and have a great weekend, everyone.
Yeah.
And the dog agrees.
You better go feed the dog. Okay, thanks, Ruth. Bye now.
Okay, bye. Okay,
ladies and gentlemen, you'll see in the sidebar your certificate of attendance for today for that short hour course. We'll be in touch. It's been recorded. We'll be in touch with the video recording, the slides. You'll get a copy of the slides. And if you can't pick up the certificate now, we'll also send that to you. So not so bad for free. Next week, as I say, we've got the labeling webinar with YASA. So we'll be sending an email about that. So please register for that. Look forward to seeing you next week. So all there is to say is, as I say every week, have a food safe day. Thanks for joining us today and sharing your time, your valuable time with us. Have a lovely weekend, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Bye, everybody. Take care.